from PRX.
From Recorded Future News, I'm Dina Temple-Rustin, and this is Click Here. General Paul Nakasone occupied what is arguably one of the most powerful intelligence roles ever created, Director of the NSA. The National Security Agency is ground zero for one of the most formidable signals intelligence operations in the world. And he's something called dual-hatted, which is Washington speak for he had another job at the same time. He led Cyber Command, the military cyber force. Back in 2018, when President Trump was in office for the first time, he allowed Cyber Command to take the gloves off. The Pentagon drew up new authorities that allowed Cybercom to target adversaries in a way it never had before, to not just defend themselves, but to go on the offensive. And the result was operations like this.
We have the fullest look yet available at a secret U.S. effort to purge the internet of the ISIS media operation.
Reports say the U.S. launched a cyber attack on Iran designed to cripple its computer systems.
General Nakasone was in charge of all that until he retired this past February. And he sat down with us on the sidelines of a supply chain conference in Washington, D.C., just a week before Americans went to the polls and voted Trump back into office. I've interviewed Nakasone about half a dozen times over the years. He was always fairly circumspect in interviews when he was at the NSA. But when we sat down earlier this month, he said nothing was off limits. I'm Dina Temple-Rustin, and this is Click Here, a podcast about all things cyber and intelligence. We tell true stories about the people making and breaking our digital world. And today, our in-depth, candid, and wide-ranging conversation with General Nakasone. We talked about everything from exploding pagers in the Middle East to why he decided to join the board of OpenAI and everything in between. And when you see North Korean troops showing up in Ukraine, I assume you see this as a big escalation.
So I see this as the redefinition of national security.
Stay with us. From Recorded Future News, this is Click Here. I'm Dina Temple-Rustin. Back in September, pagers in Lebanon began beeping just after 3:30 in the afternoon. And then something completely unexpected happened.
We want to start with an attack in the Middle East unlike anything we've ever seen before. Hundreds of wireless pagers exploded at the same time.
Tonight, shockwaves and panic across Lebanon after a stunning, unprecedented attack, both widespread and personal.
Israel had slipped into Hezbollah's supply chain, sending the Iran-backed group thousands of pagers with tiny explosives hidden inside. By day's end, a dozen people were dead and nearly 3,000 were injured. Some of the dead and wounded were members of Hezbollah, others were not, including 4 children who were killed. And I began with the pager attack when I sat down with General Paul Nakasone. I asked him whether this was a harbinger of things to come.
I think that as we have seen the pagers and the walkie-talkie attacks over the past 4 to 6 weeks, it reminds us that, the supply chain means everything. And we saw this during COVID-19. We understood that perhaps not everything that we thought was going to be part of, our national inventory was produced here. We have to be able to understand that.
Mm-hmm. Is the exploding pagers, is that going to be the next wave of non-traditional warfare, or do you think this was more of a singular thing?
So I think that there will be a number of different adversaries that take a look at this and say, how do we utilize this for the future? I think it's a piece that gives us pause and says, okay, how do we make sure that this does not happen to us?
Nakasone says this is one of the many shifts he's seen since he was commissioned in 1986.
When I came into the Army, there were two pacts, right? It was the Warsaw Pact, and of course there was NATO. And we thought about the world and really kind of, this is what the free world was doing. This is what the Soviet bloc was doing. Now we have an axis of authoritarianism that has a number of different members. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran impede the United States from being able to execute its responsibilities in this global world order. This is focused on the United States. So being able to cause us harm, being able to distract our attention, this is what the Axis is looking to do.
And when you see North Korean troops showing up in Ukraine, I assume you see this as a big escalation.
So I see this as the redefinition of national security. And I would say that this is totally different than what we thought about, 10 years ago, even 10 months ago. And so, yes, we've got to think about what's our national security strategy going to be to that? How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to look at Iran providing drones to Russians to be able to fly into Ukraine? How are we going to look at the provision of capabilities to Iran, to the Houthis and Hamas and Hezbollah in a manner that, strikes at our interests in the Middle East? These are new national security challenges that require new thinking.
So just to push you a little bit on that. So what's the reasonable response to North Korean soldiers suddenly being on the border with Ukraine to fight?
Well, I think the question becomes is what's the provision that we're going to provide to the Ukrainians that will be demonstrably impactful for them? It could very well be intelligence. I mean, this is the competitive advantages of what we do, being able to spot where troops are going to be, being able to provide the intelligence upon where they're moving to, being able to provide the weaponry upon which Ukraine is going to be able to defend themselves. These are competitive advantages to the United States.
Or how you can use particular weapons, for example.
Right. Those are all policy decisions that could be one of many different solutions.
Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, wants to use the long-range weapons the West has provided on targets deep inside Russia. And so far, Ukraine has not been allowed to do that. There's no telling what a new Trump administration might do when it comes to Ukraine. The president-elect has said that he would end the war in 24 hours, but hasn't said how. What is clear is that the presence of North Korean soldiers in the fight changes the calculus.
North Korea never really surprises me. They're always surprising, right? I mean, they're doing a number of different things that are always within their self-interest, that provide a manner of, challenge to us, whether or not it's on the demilitarized zone, whether or not it's providing support to a number of different adversaries.
One of the things that we heard from the Ukrainians and from people outside of Ukraine is that when the North Korean missiles came in, when they started providing drones and other things for them, that it gave the North Koreans a great opportunity to test their weapons against what are essentially ours and tweak them. Are you concerned that by sending troops that they're taking people who basically haven't been on the battlefield for 2 generations and helping them get better?
It's a fact. When your armed forces operate in combat, you get better. You understand the problems that come. You're able to develop solutions that get after these problems. There's no doubt about it. Just like your weapons, being able to utilize them and in conflict engagements provides them a degree of data and a degree of trustworthiness that you can't necessarily gather any other place.
In the early days of the war in Ukraine, there was this assumption that the world would see firsthand the first real hybrid war, with cyber attacks working hand in glove with traditional kinetic attacks. But it didn't really work out that way. I asked General Nakasone if there were any lessons that we might take from the war so far.
I think at the beginning we learned this lesson about the power of intelligence and being able to share intelligence publicly and the transparency that, provided challenges to President Putin and the Russian Federation. Then we learned all about the fact that being able to conduct combined arms operations isn't necessarily one of the strengths of the Russian army.
Sorry, by that you mean bringing cyber together with
Not only that, but I would say
traditional?
just combined arms being able to shoot, move, and communicate. The fact that they had trouble driving a convoy from Russia into Ukraine, it stalled for 40 miles.
Yesterday showed a 40-mile-long convoy of hundreds.
I mean, these are simple things
Russian
that the United
tanks
States
and
Army does
artillery
every single day.
approaching Kiev.
The next thing I think we learned is the fact that being able to pair developers and operators is tremendously powerful. There are 0 ships in the Ukrainian Navy, but yet over this time frame, they have sunk well over 20 Russian vessels of the Black Sea Fleet with a laptop, a Starlink connection, and a semi-submersible platform.
Are you surprised by how quickly they've innovated?
I admire the way that they've innovated. Surprised to a degree, but I would say that, necessity is the mother of invention here, and they really have gotten after this.
And does it say something about bureaucracy too? The fact that they've just sort of get it done as opposed to make it wind through something?
Well, I think agility is the piece that we all want running very large organizations. How do you become more agile? You have better partners. You have better leaders. You have better intelligence or information. Those are three things that I think that Ukraine has been able to capitalize on. And we have too at different points.
What would be an example of the way we've been able to do it?
Well, I would say that, just being able to look at the situation early on in the war and saying, hey, if we can protect our sources and methods, why don't we go ahead and release this information to take the wind out of the sails of some type of influence operation that we know the Russians are going to conduct? That's a really good way. And I think it's a fantastic way of looking at the future.
In the past, quickly declassifying intelligence and sharing it publicly in real time happened only very rarely. But just before and during the war in Ukraine, the U.S. has been able to disclose bits and pieces of intelligence to undercut Russia and the countries helping them in the fight.
The Russian government, we think, is planning to stage a fake attack by Ukrainian military or intelligence forces against Russian sovereign territory.
It isn't just naming and shaming Russia, it's actually exposing Russia's military plans in advance in order to roil them. And Nakasone said this has helped Ukraine to prepare and respond effectively. And he says the response has also been helped by the unique partnership approach they've taken.
There was a really good match between the private sector and the public sector. A number of different private sector companies working through the United States government with the government of Ukraine to bring capabilities to be able to not only spot, but provide defensive operations. And the last piece is, let's give great credit to the Ukrainians. They moved their data out of their country. They had a number of different elements upon which they set up to be able to defend their networks much more robustly. And that credit goes to them.
There was this other thing that made the cyber fight in Ukraine different. U.S. Cyber Command sent operators there in the months before the invasion to help Ukraine defend its networks against Russian cyber attacks. And the teams found over 90 pieces of malicious code that they quietly removed in the days just before Russian tanks rumbled across the border. Nakasone says that wasn't the only reason the cyber part of the war was muted, but it was part of it.
I think that has a cumulative impact. I think that any time you operate with really good forces, you become better. And you also gain a degree of confidence that I think is really important as you're facing a very sophisticated adversary in the Russians.
So we've always thought of the Russians as being not just sophisticated, but kind of 10 feet tall when it comes to cyber. Did we find out they're closer to 6'2"?
They're not 10 feet tall. Are they the most effective influence operators in the world right now? Yes. And they've done this for many, many years. Do they have very, very good cyber operators? Yes, they have very good cyber operators, but we find them just in the same way that we found SolarWinds in the close of 2020. You know, the worst thing to happen if you're the director of an intelligence organization is to be found. They were found. And as soon as you're found, then you can take actions against those folks that are in your networks. So they're good. They're not great. They're not as good as us. But they are obviously an adversary we have to continue to watch all the time.
We went to Ukraine this time last year for a couple of weeks. And one of the things we heard from them is that they felt that the Russians are really good at making very long-term plans and deciding. It's very sophisticated. But if something happens that they weren't expecting, it's hard for them to pivot. Have you seen that?
I think so. I mean, again, I come back to the start of the war with the convoy that, just seemingly was not able to go anywhere. It was stopped. Somehow, something had happened in terms of what was going on that prevented them from moving forward. And so there were no junior leaders that were saying, hey, let's go left, let's go right. This is the strength of the U.S. military, of our joint force. It's the young, well-trained, well-led, and really well-motivated NCOs that make our forces go.
When we come back, I asked General Nakasone about the China threat, his projects at Vanderbilt University and OpenAI, and how government service may not be out of his system just yet. Would you consider a job as the DNI? Stay with us.
ChatGPT, AI machines,
satellite, engine ignition,
click here,
and the liftoff.
China seems to be stepping up super aggressively in the cyber realm. Did we underestimate them?
I think we always knew that China had the one capability that provides them a unique spot in the world, which is scale. And we're seeing that scale. And so we've got to think about how we're going to defend against that scale, whether or not it's Volt Typhoon, whether or not it's Salt Typhoon, whether or not it's operations as they attempt to steal our intellectual property. What is it that we're able to do to be able to get after that scale? And so we're going to have to be able to work this really strategy forward in terms of thinking about an adversary that is many times our size in quantity, but not necessarily in quality.
So we always talk about tactics and techniques when we talk about cyber. Are China's cyber operations different from Russia's in terms of tactics and techniques, or is there sort of a basket that everybody pulls from?
Given the fact that we're in the midst of, the final days of an electoral campaign here, and you see a very, very definite pattern in terms of what Russia does. Being able to go after a series of messages, develop those messages, broadcast those messages widely, have a number of different spokespeople that do this. China is much more focused on a very, very small point in terms of what they want to go after, not necessarily the broad spectrum of things. And when they do go after that, they bring a sufficient quality and quantity of what they need to do. The challenge, however, is, I would say right now, is the Chinese actors really don't necessarily have the background in terms of the way that we operate or the way necessarily that we communicate, and it makes them stick out relatively easy.
Because they're clumsy?
Because they just don't understand I think the way that we have our thought patterns, our development of our conversations, and it looks contrived.
I see. You mean their influence operations. I then shifted gears from adversaries to innovation, and specifically how he thinks AI will be used to help with cyber defense.
I think it really begins, as I was saying, on the defensive side. Think about all the different areas you've got to be able to monitor. With AI, it becomes much more possible to rapidly identify anything that's different in the environment. I think we move from that then on to this idea of how rapidly can we allow machines necessarily to improve themselves. Self-healing networks is one of the things we always talked about at U.S. Cyber Command. This may become possible with AI. What's the level of comfort that we have with being able to make these changes, or machines making these changes that will allow us to be able to rapidly react to something that might be an intrusion early on?
So almost like a wound that heals itself if there's
Correct.
a vulnerability.
In a degree of time that's so important, right? The piece of, gathering information on an intrusion is it takes time. And during that time frame, they've established a beachhead. They've been able to move laterally. They understand what's in your network, and they start to move things out of it. Being able to immediately identify it, there's a problem, gives you an advantage.
So it's instant patching.
Instant patching.
Back in June, OpenAI appointed General Nakasone to its board of directors, saying he will help protect the ChatGPT maker from, and this is their language, increasingly sophisticated bad actors. This appointment came shortly after a moment of public turmoil for the company. The board abruptly fired the CEO, Sam Altman, and part of the board was let go. Altman was reinstated days later, and then other board members departed. Nakasone was among the new appointees filling out that group. Nakasone is also joining OpenAI's new Safety and Security Committee, which is supposed to advise the full board on critical safety and security decisions for its projects and operations. The safety group replaced an earlier safety team that had been disbanded after several of its leaders quit. Given all that, I asked Nakasone why he chose to advise OpenAI and not some other AI company.
I believe that the most disruptive technology of the near, present, and future is artificial intelligence. It is the most disruptive technology that we must remain the leaders in. To be able to do that, we have to be able to ensure both its security and its safety. I'm bringing the ideas of what we're able to do with the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command to bear, hopefully, in securing this incredibly important intellectual property.
And you feel like OpenAI is the one that's going to strike that balance better than some of the
certainly, I'm
others?
very, very committed to working with Sam Altman and the members of OpenAI to make sure that we continue to advance what was going on. November of 2022, many of us saw for the first time ChatGPT, the fastest growing app on the internet. Over 300 million weekly users now. In November of 2022, it was a very, very mediocre high school student. Today, it's passing the bar, medical exams, all advanced placement tests. This is advancing very rapidly. And the idea of being able to now reason with a number of different tools in artificial intelligence, I think this portends exactly how fast we're moving and the importance of being able to protect this intellectual property.
And had you had that in mind, that you would try and help develop this when you left the NSA, or did the phone call kind of come out of nowhere?
Well, I think that I would say that I knew leaving NSA and U.S. Cyber Command that I did want to make sure that, this competitive advantage of the United States, which is our innovation, which is right now, demonstrated in artificial intelligence, needed to continue. And so OpenAI just happened to be the vehicle upon which we were able to move that forward.
If AI is going to remake a society, which I think in some ways most people think it will it be more beneficial, or what worries you about it?
So it will always be beneficial as we continue to be the leaders in AI. If we become second place, then our adversaries will use this to monitor us, to develop cyber weaponry, to utilize it in a manner that will be really, vastly harmful to our national security. We can figure out the areas that are challenges right now with AI, whether or not that's job displacement, whether or not that's autonomous weaponry, all these things that are tremendously challenging as we think about this development of this capability are able to be done as long as we're the leader. And so I do believe that will be the case.
Talk a little bit about life after the NSA. I'm not sure you're there yet, but the beginnings of life after.
Life after the United States Army began on the 1st of April, 2024, as I retired. It has been a tremendous journey. I spent nearly 6 years leading United States Cyber Command, the National Security Agency. And as I concluded that portion of my life, the next phase starts. And the next phase really was this idea of, first of all, being able to give back. So the idea of perhaps going back to education, in this sense, Vanderbilt University, opening up the Institute of National Security. It's also bringing my talents in terms of what I've been able to do over the past 10 years, which is really cybersecurity, bringing that to a number of different companies that I think need to have that information. And the last part is just enjoying the next part of what life is like. It doesn't begin at 4 o'clock in the morning anymore. There's no one that calls me at 2 o'clock in the morning anymore. It's a much different way of the way I conduct myself.
So tell me what you're going to do at Vanderbilt.
What I had realized over my time in 6 years leading both the agency and the command is that the national security environment had changed. The fact that we were no longer just focused on traditional threats, but we had a series of borderless challenges, whether or not it was ransomware or terrorism or climate change or global pandemics. We had to think differently about what's going on. We've got to attack these problems with a series of radical partnerships. This is what I learned as I thought about Hunt Forward operations. What made Hunt Forward operations successful was the fact that we paired both the government and the private sector. We have to do that with problems that we're facing in the near, mid, and far term for our national security. Here's the other piece. At the same time we're trying to do that, we have the largest demographic change ongoing in the United States government since really the 1980s. We have a whole new generation of young people that we need to come be leaders and leadership for them as we move forward. And being able to do that, they have to have the knowledge, skills, and ability that are probably much different than their predecessors had, whether or not it's artificial intelligence, whether or not it's quantum mechanics, whether or not it's just leadership in general or strategic communication. These are the things that we've got to be able to bring. So hard problems, demographic change with new knowledge, skills, and ability. That's what we're trying to do at Vanderbilt University.
And how do you do that?
Well, I think first of all, you begin with excitement, then internships, then bringing a number of thought leaders to Nashville to say, hey, this is what's being done. Last week, we had General Retired Frank McKenzie to come and talk to the students. He had just written a book called The Melting Point. And I was thinking, being an economics major at my undergraduate level, that'd be like having the Fed chair come talk to my class. And that was the really neat thing, Dana, about bringing people that have done this type of work. This provides excitement. This provides ideas. This provides motivation for the future.
So here's my lightning round for you. Would you consider a job as the DNI?
I would consider a job coming back into the government, if the president, had asked and I thought it was best for my skills, whether or not it's, the Director of National Intelligence or other positions within the government, I would certainly consider it.
Okay. Right away?
Probably not.
Okay. What's the biggest lesson that you learned as the head of NSA?
The trust and confidence of the American people. I realized that early on that I was the person that had to ensure the trust and confidence in our agency with the American people. And how I did that, whether or not it was through interviews or whether or not it was talking to the public or whether or not it was demonstrating what we did, was really important.
What was the thing that you wanted to do at the NSA that you couldn't do?
I wanted to finish the leadership development that we had started. I talked about the demographic changes that are happening right now in the government workforce. The challenge of bringing a whole new generation on is you lose a whole body of leadership. I wanted to make sure that young folks have the leadership lessons that are going to make them be successful. The most important critical element within an organization, leadership.
This is Click Here. And then if you were going to give us a big scoop, what would it be?
Big scoop.
Yeah.
Wow. Big scoop is the fact that I am nearly undefeated in my fantasy football league this year. And so, I don't brag about that much, but I would tell you that
Who's your
only
quarterback?
2 losses. My quarterback last night was Russell Wilson.
Here are some of the top cyber and intelligence stories of the past week.
Just into the newsroom, officials have evacuated 2 polling locations in Fulton County, Georgia, after they received bomb threats. The threats were aimed at 5 locations.
Election day came and went, and the votes have been tallied without the violence that many had expected. Disinformation was on full display, though. Multiple polling locations in Georgia got bomb threats, but they turned out to have been sent from Russian email accounts. Fulton County, home to places like Atlanta and Alpharetta, said that voting on Tuesday was interrupted by some 32 separate bomb threats, sent via both phone and email. And it happened in other battleground states, too. While Russian interference in American elections is nothing new, the sheer volume of the campaigns and the way U.S. officials called them out sets the 2024 race apart from any that's come before it. The Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, proposed new rules that would require pipeline and railway operators to report cyber incidents and create cyber risk management plans. The TSA issued a roster of security directives after the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack in 2021. And under the rules they proposed last week, those directives would become permanent. Among other things, the rules would require annual cybersecurity evaluations, assessments that identify unaddressed vulnerabilities, and would require pipelines and railways to designate officials who would be responsible for cybersecurity. Organizations would be required to report cyber incidents to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. TSA said it estimates that the proposed rule would impact about 300 surface transportation owners and operators. And finally, something's not right in the dog days of a slightly different election.
But there are some claims of voter fraud, and this time it's in New York's all-important honorary dog mayor race.
New York City's dog mayoral election reportedly has been hijacked by cryptocurrency fanatics who decided to back one particular pup. Allegedly, members of the crypto community promoting their new Bert coin decided to back Bertram the Pomeranian in the race, even going so far as to offer financial incentives in exchange for votes for Bertram. The contest got so heated that Enzo the Shih Tzu was yanked from the race when his owner, Olivia Caputo, told the New York Post that he'd been threatened. Woof.
Today's episode was produced by Megan Dietrich, Sean Powers, Erica Gaida, and me, Jade Abdul Malik. It was edited by Karen Duffin, fact-checked by Darren Ankrum, and contains original music by Ben Livingston, with some other music from Blue Dot Sessions. Our staff writer is Lucas Riley, and our illustrator is Megan Goff. Martin Peralta is our sound designer and engineer. Click Here is a production of Recorded Future News. Tune in on Friday for Mic Drop, which features our favorite interview of the week. We'll have a new episode of Click Here on Tuesday. We'll see you then.